Welcome to Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear, where integrative oncology meets holistic healing. This podcast is your home for the latest in innovation, exploration, and elevation in all areas of integrative oncology, medicine, health, wellness, and beyond. Join me and a host of other innovators as we go from practicing to prescribing. Your daily dose of wellness begins now. All right, welcome back to another Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear podcast. I want to start this podcast off. We've got a great guest, and you're gonna really love Nicholas, and I'll let him give you a little bit of his background and its relevance, but I'll serve him up a little bit. But I want to start off with a question. What if the information required to impact your health, your family health, your loved ones, whatever, even talking about America, make America healthy again. What if that information was hidden from you? Might we call that censorship? I would. What if that information involved the changing landscape of, say, cardiovascular disease or something like cancer? In today's episode, we're going to dive into the critical concept of medical censorship, healthcare censorship, but I'm going to do a little bit of a connection here to turbo cancer because you know me, I love to talk about and empower those of you who are battling this thing called cancer. So let's look at that word censor. And again, I've gone over this quite a bit. You know, this etymology, the root origin of this word goes back to 17th century, empowering officials to determine if anything is immoral or heretical in books, films, and plays. Remember, Hitler did that. 19th century, they changed it, updated this root word origin to state agent charged with suppression of speech or narrative deemed counter to the approved political narrative. And then the suffix there, ship, means power, office, position. So what we have with censorship is government office position with power to suppress speech or narrative that is deemed counter to the approved political narrative. And of course, turbo cancer is that term, sudden aggressive onset of cancer. Probably first around late 2020 is when it first kind of hit the public consciousness. And Uta Gruger, a pathologist from Germany, actually said in 2019, but now it feels like I'm watching people being killed and I cannot do anything. As a pathologist, she says, I diagnose tumors that maybe have caused by another colleague with a shot. So, you know, what we do in science today, what we do in medicine, and what we do in education is they teach us a lot how to collect dots, how to think the way we're taught to think. But what we have to do today is connect the dots because nobody in the control of the narrative is going to say, oh, you're right, we've been trying to censor you, or you're right, there is a change in cancer. So we have to collect and connect. That's why we're bringing you on the experts to do that. So I don't want to leave any more time on my talk. I want to bring him in. So let me give you his accolades, if you will, because he brings some very unique experience and credentials that I think are going to help us here. His name is Nicholas Hulscher. He's an epidemiologist and foundation administrator at the McCullough Foundation. Yes, that's right. He has a master's of public health from the University of Michigan. You know, I'm south of the Mason-Dixon line, and I don't like it when it gets below 60, Nicholas. So my goodness gracious, I don't know how you do it up there. And he's authored numerous relevant papers. And there's one from November 2024 that's a beautiful article. You need to read it. Systemic Review of Autopsy Findings in Death After COVID-19 Vaccination. Great article. One earlier in January. And at least as I can see, Nicholas, at least 15 papers that you've been lead or co-author in. Nicholas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on your great show.
Yeah, well, you know, people like you are just, you're a pioneer, but you're really blazing a trail, I think, in helping us to bring science back to its original purpose, because it has strayed during the pandemic. It strayed. But, you know, that November 2024 article that you authored with many others, obviously, I think it's a great article to start off with because you opened my eyes. The percentages and the impact I was blown away by. So could you just kind of give the listeners a breakdown on that review article from November of 2024?
Yeah, so that article, that systematic review, turned out to be the craziest journey probably ever with a research paper, and I'll go over what happened. So this was the very first paper. It was approved by University of Michigan as basically a thesis, a thesis to graduate. And so we had to do a study. And so I contacted all the professors at U of M. Almost all of them said no, or they just ignored the email. And so I thought, Dr. McCullough, I'm a big fan of his. He's been trailblazing. He's been telling the truth this whole time. Why don't I email him? So I email him, and within 5 minutes, he comes up and sends me this study idea about a systematic review of all the autopsies. And so from then on, we went on to conduct that systematic review. We went through 600 or so studies, screened them, and in the end, we found 44 studies that included autopsies in individuals that died after COVID-19 vaccination. And so from that, we independently adjudicated each case by their autopsy findings, by the temporality, so how long after the vaccine did they die, and also by any comorbidities they may have had. And so and I'll get into this in a second here of that, why we chose that kind of methodology. But we found that 73.9% of all these autopsies, all these people that died, were due to the vaccine. And so we also found that within a week, most of the cases died within a week. The mean time from vaccination to death was 14 days, so 2 weeks. And so it basically proved, now we have it, published in a peer-reviewed journal. It's proven that these vaccines can kill people. They can, it's undeniable. And so this paper was uploaded into the Lancet preprint server in June of 2023. It was only there for 24 hours. It got hundreds of thousands of reads and downloads, and then all of a sudden, Elsevier or somebody that works there was extremely disappointed. They didn't want people to see critical genetic injection safety data, and so they wiped it basically immediately. And then began the 8-month-long journal review process. Actually, not 8 months, a year long of submitting to these journals, getting repeated rejections without any review. And then one time we got peer review, and the reviewers just wrote 2 sentences, just nonsense, no constructive feedback, and just said basically the vaccines are safe, reject the paper. And finally, we got the Forensic Science International, and they reviewed the paper. It took them like 6 months, but they reviewed it, 2 peer reviewers, and they found that our paper was good. They wanted it to be published. The reviewers said it was solid science, and it contributes to the knowledge base of adverse effects from these shots. And so it was published in June of 2024 in this PubMed Index journal. And then, unfortunately, within 1 month, the Elsevier or somebody was upset, called Elsevier, and they wiped the paper off the webpage. They retracted it. And this was after it became actually the number one, according to the Observatory of International Research. This paper was the number one most accessed paper worldwide across all subject categories when it was published. So you might understand why certain people would be upset and they want it removed. So they removed it. They wiped it off the webpage. They didn't even leave a trace behind. Usually they leave at least the PDF and just plaster retract it all over it, but they didn't even do that. So, and then finally, after a second round of peer review at this non-biased journal Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law. It's finally now published for the entire world to see, and it's been improved now over many iterations of these reviews. And so we encountered just so much censorship, so much backlash in trying to get this published. And it just shows that the entire journal system, this journal cartel, is extremely corrupt, extremely biased, and it's nearly impossible to get important vaccine research through and get it published.
I did not know that backstory. I'm blown away at that because, I mean, that is, I don't even have to ask the question, is that censorship? That's absolutely what that is. But that's kind of a shadowy censorship because in one way, the original censorship, it sounds like you kind of recognize where that came from. But it sounds like that second time was a little shadowy. You don't really know where the sources and where the directive came to say, take it down.
Right, because the editors in chief signed off on it, so they liked the paper, they let it get up. And so you're right, and these so-called anonymous post-publication reviewers that looked at it, it's weird that they don't tell us who they are, but they just claim that, oh, you got to take it down. It's not supported by its methodology. And one thing about the methodology, they don't like how we didn't use the author's conclusions. But I'll explain why that's basically foolish and we shouldn't have used it, because these injections were novel, right? They just were created, rolled out in 2021. We didn't know at that time most of these injury syndromes, or at least a lot of them. They weren't known. And so when these autopsies were initially published in the peer-reviewed literature, the authors didn't know that the vaccines could cause VITT. They didn't know the vaccines could cause cerebral hemorrhaging or even myocarditis in some cases, because they were all early on. So if we took the author's conclusions, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't. How could the authors have concluded this was due to the vaccine when they didn't have any of the information? So in 2023, we had all the information, and we were able to properly assess these deaths as being possibly linked to the vaccine.
Well, this probably wasn't your first go around as it relates to censorship, was it?
No, it wasn't the first. Actually, with every single paper now we've tried to get published, I mean, it takes months, it takes years. We have a paper now. It's been ongoing in the peer review process for over a year. It's actually a case report. Some guy got a deadly Pfizer batch, and he died actually a year and a half later. He started coughing up blood, choked on his own blood. Nobody wants anything to do with that. They don't want to publish delayed adverse events. That's why we don't see that evidence in the literature, because journals refuse to publish it. And so we experience this all the time. The thing is even if a journal is under one of these cartel publishers like Elsevier, the journals can still get the paper in. Like the editors in chief, they'll like the paper, but it just always comes down to who's the publisher. And if the publisher is part of this censorship cabal, they will eventually retract the study.
Yeah, so, there's a really famous quote, and that's what I was doing, pulling up a quote from Sir William Osler, obviously very important in the historical medicine, in terms of, how we practice medicine, both the blend of science and art. Remember, the art side of medicine is the creative application of that foundation of science. If we swing too far on a pendulum one way or the other, basically we get out of balance, and that, I think, affects our care. But it's a great quote. It says, "The greater the ignorance, the greater the dogmatism." And so you were talking about these authors didn't know. Was that intentional or not? Probably early on it was unintentional. But it seems to me that's what's happening here, because when people think about censorship, Nicholas, and people like you are just, you're bulldogs. You guys are working to get information out to people because that's the right thing. That's what scientists do. That's what medical doctors do. we serve and are advocates for our patients. But what we're seeing here is not that direct obstruction. We are seeing some of that, but I think that's obvious to see. Here, it's, as you said, you're keeping out these sequelae. We're keeping out these terrible morbidities and mortality cases. You mentioned that case study. You're keeping them out of the public consciousness. So in a way, they're ignorant. And thus, dogmatism takes over the narrative.
Right. That makes 100% of sense, and that captures exactly what's happening. I mean, the problem, I think, the primary issue of why they are denying these papers is because they have subscribed to vaccine ideology, this new religion or cult, whatever you want to call it. Once you subscribe to that and have taken 6 genetic booster injections, it's very hard to exit that religion. It's very hard to accept that you have severely probably injured your body. You have severely shortened your lifespan, possibly. That's now shown by multiple studies, a reduced lifespan. But so it's very hard for them to accept it, and they're going to continue that it's safe and effective because, quite frankly, it keeps them comfortable with their decisions.
Yeah, and I think history is going to correct that wrong for sure. I'm curious in terms of your data with this study. I loved reading it. I'm a geek like that, so I love to get into the methodology of papers before I get into anything else. But was there any correlation or trend that you saw in the number of injections, the number of boosters, with what you saw in sequelae and mortality with it? Was there earlier mortality? Did you see anything there?
So with this study, since most of the cases were published early on in the injection campaign, most of the cases only got 1, 2, 3 doses. I don't even think there was one with 4 doses. So these were all just initially. Now, there's 4 studies that show batch-dependent safety of these shots. And we know now that actually the earlier batches that were rolled out initially were actually way more dangerous than these later iterations. So, and there's people that say they changed the process of manufacturing as time went on, which would lessen some of these side effects, lessen some of this contamination in the manufacturing process, maybe standardize the dose a bit. But also, I guess when now people are up to 5, 6, 7 doses, there's only like 10% of the population's doing that. So it's such a smaller sample size now that's going to be detected for any of these adverse events. And so, but regarding our study, just 1 to 3 doses.
Well, that's interesting because with the boosters, what we see is when somebody gets 3 boosters, that's when things go really sideways. I mean, it's just, the science begins with observation, right? I mean, that's interesting. Now let's create a study to see if there is an association, correlation, and then hopefully eventually prove cause and effect if you can. And, I can remember early on in the pandemic where I had 2 patients that were in remission and had been in remission for quite some time. And now they didn't get vaccinated. They did not get vaccinated. They got COVID. Now this was early on, so this was Omicron. And I mean, within 4 weeks, not only recurrence, and we had a scan on one patient that was 4 weeks prior to that. So it was the most rapid thing I had seen ever. Everywhere. The cancer had come back and had gone everywhere in essentially 4, 6 weeks. And so that power, that observation, is really what began my view of going, okay, something's off here. And so with what you've described here in this study and in others is you're laying the groundwork, you're connecting some dots in, mortality, cardiovascular disease. And for my mind, it doesn't take much to connect one more dot about turbo cancer. But clearly what you're saying is that these injections, these jabs, these boosters, whatever, at least in relationship to this study, they cause death. Is that right?
They cause death, and they cause death via so many different mechanisms, some by so many different organ systems that contribute to the primary cause of death. I mean, it's overwhelmingly cardiovascular. That's what we found in the study. It's about 50%. That's followed by blood clotting issues, and then it goes immunological, and then multi-organ system involvement. And so it does. It just damages the entire body. And yeah, regarding cancer, yeah, I've seen now this population level data. You've seen a ethical skeptic on X. He's made some graphs. He's I guess he's collated the CDC data, and he's found that since right after the injections rolled out, the excess cancer deaths just skyrocketed. I mean, there's so many cancer deaths now, way more than expected, and it hasn't gone down. And I know that there's a paper published in Curious by, I believe, by Anguis. He and his co-author have demonstrated that the multi-hit hypothesis of oncogenesis have been fulfilled with these injections. And I know one of the possible mechanisms is that suppression of the P53 tumor suppressor gene. And so there are most definitely these plausible mechanisms. We see now there's probably 20 or so, maybe more, case reports published now in the peer-reviewed literature showing these cancers pop up out of nowhere, these massive tumors, these turbo cancers. And so, yeah, it's definitely causing these cancers. And I know there's also, right, and I know you're the expert in this, but do you see, so you see a lot, like maybe the cancer's dormant, right, in the body, and then they get these injections, and then that's just the final straw, right? Their body can't handle it. Immunologically, they get severely messed up, and then this cancer just grows everywhere. Is that right?
Yeah. So actually, early on, that first patient I was describing there, the vaccine hadn't even come out. It hadn't even come out, and so I may have the variant wrong there because I lost track of whatever they decided to name it, like it was some kind of hurricane or something. It was ridiculous what they were doing. But yeah, so once we though got into the vaccines, and one of the things that I've always said, Nicholas, is that, it's spike protein, whether injection or infection. One of the
Right.
things, and this is another censorship. Again, I think if you keep ideas away from people, you can more control their thoughts. But it was really interesting because there was a 2020, it was not an article, but it was on a university website, and it was published in 2022. And they said that studies indicate that messenger RNA from the vaccines, like Pfizer and Moderna, primarily remains at the injection site and nearby lymph nodes, and it's rapidly degraded within a few days. That's not true.
It's not true at all. Now first of all, we have the 2 biodistribution studies performed in rats a few years ago before the injections were rolled out, or it might have even been after, but they didn't release it till well into the campaign publicly. And it found that the lipid nanoparticles and mRNA go to literally every organ system. And so that was that. And then we have this new study now in Nature Biotechnology that it shows this lipid nanoparticle mRNA does in fact go everywhere after intramuscular injection, which is what people get, right? They inject it in the deltoid in the arm. And so just that, it doesn't have to be IV. It still goes throughout the entire body. It gets into the heart. It gets into the brain. And so it's terrible. And what this new study showed, which now confirms it, is that your whole body does indeed become a spike protein production factory. They did show that it did express in the head, in the heart, and in these organs. And so that just kind of seals the deal that, yes, this spike protein is produced everywhere, and it's very dangerous. I can't believe this was allowed to get through, and I can't believe it's still being recommended for babies 6 months and older.
Oh yeah, I don't want to go down that road because history is going to judge this in a very, very negative way. But two things I want to mention or ask your opinion on, because when you look at cancer, there's a physician by the name of Dvorak that published back in the 19th century that a tumor is a wound that does not heal. Have you seen, or did you see, we're talking about myocarditis, blood clots. Is there a preference or propensity for the spike protein here, especially talking about injection? Does it have a preference for prior inflammatory sites? Your literature showed it causes inflammation, but does it get attracted to those prior injurious areas?
That's a great question, and I wonder if that's the case. I'm not sure, to be honest, but what I do know is where, at least after injection, where the nanoparticles preferentially go is the ovaries. Um, and I'm not sure exactly why that's the case, but that's what happens. But yeah, I'm not sure if it goes particularly to these already inflamed sites. Yeah, that's a great question. That deserves its own study.
Well, and that's one of the things that I've thought about is because, again, that whole descriptive term, it's a wound that does not heal. It is immune dysfunction. And you in this 2024 paper, you talk about the hyperactivation of the immune system or the immune disruption, inflammation. It's the same. And people think, well, inflammation, that's good, right? It's like, well, it depends on what aspects of the immune system, the immune cells that you're stimulating or even maybe suppressing. Because if you're talking about cancer, or we could even be talking about the heart, right? If you're coming in and you're suppressing the immune system's ability to repair that process, now you're shifting this process where it can become a much bigger problem. And one of the things that I think is really interesting here is there was this class that I had during medical school. Drove me nuts, but now I spend more time looking at this than anything else. It's this principle of pharmacokinetics. And, it's a basic pharmacology principle. And that course, I hated it. When we walked down the hallway to go to get our test scores, we were the first medical school class that actually had a laptop. They didn't know what to do with it. They just made us get one. And so we go down the hallway, and I just called it was our our walk of death. It's our last walk. But that is so important here, because the injection into the muscle, the vaccination here or anything, basic pharmacokinetic principles of what's called LADME, liberation, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion. I don't really know much that gets injected into the body and just stays there. People talk about pellets and hormones. They go, oh, it stays there. And it's like, well, have you checked their hormones? It's through the roof. So have you ever seen that where, they defy basic pharmacokinetics. It makes no sense from the beginning.
Right, right. I can't believe why they even thought that it would be okay to, approve of a product that does violate all proper safety protocols for this biodistribution. And I can't believe why they lied and said it does just stay in the arm. I don't even know where they got that information from. I think it is completely a lie. And so, yeah, for some reason, regarding most other pharmaceutical products, they do check and see, where does it go. They do make sure that it doesn't go into every single organ system, at least in a lot of cases. But for the ones that were administered to the entire population, they simply didn't care, or at least even they probably or could have intentionally done that.
Nicholas, what does censorship mean to you? Because you laid out this backstory of this article, this study that I was not aware of. But what does censorship mean to you? Because you've experienced it firsthand on multiple levels.
Censorship means the suppression of real information. So the suppression of scientifically true information, because the person that is suppressing and censoring is usually nefarious or malevolent, right? So somebody who's good and wants the best for people, I don't think they're going to want to just block people from disseminating any information. So, yeah, I think it's the censorship of true information by nefarious actors.
So you've been censored by corporations, publishing companies. I mean, have you been censored, outside of that? Has it always been this kind of publication route of censorship, or have there been other examples that you and the foundation maybe have experienced censorship?
Every single day on LinkedIn for our foundation account, we face censorship terribly. I mean, every day LinkedIn takes down a post for so-called misinformation. They took down my personal LinkedIn account twice for misinformation. And there's no misinformation. I always post like the PubMed link, the link to the study, and I just say exactly what the study says. And they wiped me off of LinkedIn twice now. I had to contact the Better Business Bureau to get back onto it. And so these guys are basically criminals. They're just trying to hide any information now that's showing these harms. And so that's just with LinkedIn.
Wow.
And we also face this on, or I personally faced this at University of Michigan. When I was doing that systematic review, I've had professors come to me and say, listen, don't work with Dr. McCullough. It's not smart. You're not going to have a career. He's anti-vaccine. I think they were 100% wrong, first off. Now people in our movement, this medical freedom movement, are now rising to the top of public health governmental power. And so these professors that thought they were so correct, they tried to stop this. They tried to stop me from working with Dr. McCullough. And so, yeah, it occurs everywhere.
So there was censorship at the level of education.
Yes, correct.
Because education is supposed to be that, that area. I'm a little bit removed from that. You look to be younger than myself, but where it was supposed to be open to new ideas, new thoughts, challenge the paradigm, challenge the status quo, right? Challenge the narrative and basically bridge new ideas to the past, to the future. And that's what I see in medicine, is that censorship is present. And you're saying you see it at the academic setting as well.
Yep. And I saw it when I presented the paper at the University of Michigan epidemiology poster session, when I presented the autopsy paper. And I had professors that have gone to class for 6 months, and they walked by. They didn't even look at me. They didn't even say hi. I mean, so they were clearly angry. And so it seems there's a lot of anger in these people that like to censor and like to shut down any scientific debate. And it's just disappointing, Progress in science does only come with proper debate.
Oh, thank you. That's what I say. Oh, my goodness gracious. You are a scientist at your core. I tell them, look, if it's not open debate and discourse of the ideas presented and discussed in the paper, it's not science. So you're a scientist. I'm a scientist as a doctor. Do you ever remember being asked, because one of the things that was presented to us is the trust the science, right? Which by its nature is, unscientific. What they're saying there is they don't question us. Then there was a consensus of experts and a consensus of scientists. Has anybody ever reached out to you to say, hey, who would you want to be your expert representing you? Or are you want to be a part of this consensus? I mean, none of this is science. None of it.
None of it. Absolutely none of it. It's basically propaganda. That's what I would call it. It's government driven narratives that literally don't allow anything to stray from the narrative. I mean, so it's really disappointing. It really is. And, this reminds me now of this upcoming.
Hadn't stopped you.
What was that? Sorry.
It hasn't stopped you, Nicholas. It hasn't stopped you in the foundation.
Yeah, we want to continue and disseminate truthful research regardless of what the repercussions may be. And this has angered people like Peter Hotez. So in the last week, Peter Hotez has actually quoted 3 of my posts on X trying to debunk it. And his so-called debunking attempts are ridiculous. He quoted that recent lipid nanoparticle study in Nature Biotechnology, and he said, no, the paper doesn't show anything. It doesn't show that. It just shows how nanoparticles move in the body. It's like, so they're just liars. I mean, literally blatantly lying. He's blocked all comments. Nobody can comment on his posts. So these people, I mean, they're basically, I can only think that their intentions are nefarious at this point.
Agreed. I want to touch on the foundation here in just a moment. And again, thank you for your time. And I know it's probably a little chilly up there in Michigan. By the way, here in Arizona, it was a high of 70 today. It was, kind of nice. But in about 4 months, it's going to be stupid hot. So you're going to be loving it and we're not. But there was an article that came out in 2024, again, talking about the persistence of spike proteins in the brain. Now, and when you look at some of the risks identified, right? Stroke, clots, dementia, or cognitive decline. I mean, you're seeing a lot of things getting into the brain, which tells me that probably the spike proteins are damaging the blood-brain barrier. And when you damage the blood-brain barrier, that's how you're going to get all of these, CNS issues that pose such great risk and probably was causing a lot of the mortalities in some of the patients that you saw in that study. But if you damage the blood-brain barrier, that's also the means by which cancer gets in the brain. And there was a Swedish study back in the earlier 2000s that showed that even from 2000 to 2004, there was a 44% increase in brain metastasis then compared to the late 1980s to 90s. Can you touch on that topic? What are you aware of about the spike protein and the blood-brain barrier and the brain and that particular 2024 study?
Yeah, so there's this study. I think the first author is wrong. I think it's wrong, yeah. But what he found was, or what they found was the spike protein. First of all, they injected just spike protein into rats' brains to see what would happen. And this spike protein, sorry, that was one point. Let me start with the first point. The first point was these rats, I think they infected it with COVID, with SARS-CoV-2. And what they found was the spike protein not only persists in the body, it goes to the brain. They find it in this brain meninges axis, and it's just stuck there. And they found it associated with this inflammation, with this dysfunction. And so they basically proved that this is spike protein is a neurotoxic substance. And so, I mean, it's terrible. And it explains why now we have these 3 other studies that do show large increased risks in Alzheimer's, large increased risks in cognitive impairment, in depression, in sleep disorders, and in anxiety disorders. So this is all increased after vaccination. These were studies out of Korea, with a few million people, I believe, in these studies. And so it's just terrible. We now have over 300 peer-reviewed studies. We actually have this archived in Zenodo. It's all listed there. You can see each study. And so there's 300 studies that demonstrate that the spike protein alone is highly pathogenic, right? So if we just take the spike, like what's derived from the shots, that itself is highly pathogenic. And so the fact that they even used this platform to express spike protein, it's just shocking. Why didn't they express any other protein? Why did they pick the most dangerous one?
So then I got to ask you, so if it disrupts the blood-brain barrier, obviously, and it creates all the CNS sequelae you mentioned, um, is this, there's a spike protein and then there's the virus. If you look at the literature, there are 8 known cancer-causing viruses, oncovirus. And there's fairly good synergy in terms of what is a cancer-causing virus. Its transmission between humans, chronic infection, co-opts cellular processes, undermines immune recognition, derails signaling pathways, and supports propagation. Maybe it's the spike protein, maybe it's the virus with the spike protein, but could we say that this is a similar process to like hepatitis C, HPV, EBV, and the connection to the cancers there? And for me, it's again, they're not going to come out and say mea culpa, our bad, we're wrong. We have to connect these dots on our own.
So you think, are you saying, so you think if somebody's infected by SARS-CoV-2, it brings these dormant viruses out? Is that?
I think it's a cancer-causing virus because if you look at the literature and how they describe a cancer-causing virus, hepatitis C, HPV, EBV, et cetera, HIV, it's like, wow, it checks every box. It checks every box. It hijacks pathways. It creates chronic inflammation. It actually reactivates other oncogenic viruses. I mean, it's like, why is nobody talking about this? But it's probably because of the censorship, or people are afraid that they're going to get censored. And so because of that fear, they don't speak, which in and of itself is a form of censorship.
Now, you think possible reason for that is because this particular virus was engineered in these biosafety labs, and whatever they did, whatever they modified, made this virus particularly carcinogenic?
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of articles written about the HIV component of this, and Kaposi sarcoma, that's a well-known malignancy associated with HIV. But I think it's more or less how it behaves. And when you look at those viruses, it's hard to say that this is not that case. Now, I think with the boosters and the injections with the spike protein, that's a little bit of a different thing because it's not necessarily the virus, it's the spike protein. But as you said, it's a toxin. And I mean, goodness gracious, the literature is laid out with the impact of whether it's toxins or toxicants and their connection to cancer. And it's like, it's like what the questions you're asking. It's like, well, you can't ask these questions anymore. It's pretty solid science. Now here we can't because nobody's asking those questions yet. And that's why I wanted to bring you in, because you've been asking these questions about causes of death and mortality. Again, most of it being cardiovascular, because I think the next question needs to be cancer, because for me, I think it's the pandemic that nobody's talking about. It's one that allows companies to make a lot of money, and it sure impacts every family. And it seems to fit into, that process of what we came out with the pandemic. And the epigenetics of it too. I don't even think we've begun to see what's going to happen from this.
Right. And we know that the specified follow-up period for new genetic products is 5 to 15 years. So we're basically reaching that 5-year mark. So yeah, we don't know what's going to happen in 20 years to all these people that either, like you said, got infected or got injected. And so, yeah, it's just, we don't know. And regarding the cancer, I've been told by there's a physician in a large medical center, and he says, since these injections rolled out, he's seen like all these 10-year-olds, all these kids now coming with colon cancer. I mean, he's never seen it before, and he's afraid to talk about it. He doesn't want to speak up. He doesn't want to do any studies. And so I think that's a big problem. We need to conduct these studies. We need people that observe these cancers to speak up. And I think we need now, possibly with this new administration, it would be really nice to see if they can now take this federal data, combine it with these cancer registries, combine it with dose data, stratify it by dose of how many genetic injections they got, And then maybe we can finally get to the bottom of it with large scale studies and just finally prove it. Because it's clear, I think, if we did conduct that study, there would be massive increases found.
Yeah. Well, when most people were dealing with fear, you clearly, I think, you were just brave. You just stood up and you were just going to follow the science. You were going to lead with the science. And I think that's why you persevered. And that's why I wanted you to basically share your story and your journey on this concept. Because early on during the pandemic, doctors, I didn't know what to think. I was like, this is crazy. You're talking about ivermectin, and I've been using that for years. What are you talking about? It's a horse dewormer. It was all so crazy. But it was people like you and Peter McCullough that and others that I've talked to that you guys just you knew what was right. You stayed solid in the science and you just pushed forward despite the pushback, despite the censorship. And now I want to do is just highlight your foundation. So tell our listeners about your foundation, as you told me before the recording, and the purpose here, because I think this is something that is going to then help us to bring forth the next generation of the impact that you're going to bring.
So first thing that I would advise your listeners to do is go follow the McCullough Foundation on X. It's just at McCullough Fund, and you're going to see basically everything we're doing. Also visit our website at mcculloughfnd.org. And so what we've been doing, we began operating in 2023. And so what we've done since then is we're based on 4 pillars. So the first pillar is investigative scholarship. So what this means is basically it just means research, publishing these papers, publishing these studies. And so far, since 2023, we have published 20 peer-reviewed manuscripts, significantly contributing to the knowledge base of the harms caused by these injections. We've touched on bird flu, and we're touching on other subjects. And so we're trying to get this knowledge out in this peer-reviewed literature so people will take it seriously. So the government and large foundations will take this knowledge seriously. So there's that. And then the second pillar that we focus on is public and physician education. So we've put out multiple small video documentaries. We put out multiple videos each day, actually, that are totally edited. We add B-roll. We add all this stuff. But regarding the documentary, the biggest one would be bird flu separating fact from fiction. And we just kind of lay out, what's bird flu? What is the government saying that's wrong? So I advise your listeners to go check that out. That's on YouTube. And so we do that. We disseminate this information. We go on podcasts like yours frequently and disseminate information. And the third facet is justice. So Dr. McCullough has participated now in hundreds of court cases assisting in the pursuit of justice, particularly regarding now all these mandates that happen, all this disastrous stuff. So we do that. We support that. We support these court cases. And then public policy is the last pillar. This is when we're disseminating our policy recommendations, what we think the government should do, especially regarding conducting certain studies, what the science says that would lead us to do certain policy decisions. And so all 4 of these pillars make up our mission at the McCullough Foundation.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because what we're going to do is when we drop this particular episode, we are going to basically send out throughout that entire month regular social media posts directing you to the McCullough Foundation, where you can support them however you see best, because these are our allies for truth. These are our allies against censorship. And we need to support our friends and our allies in this move, because they pulled back the curtain on the Great Oz. We know who we're up against. And so we need to find out who our allies are, and we need to work with them. Nicholas, thank you so much for your persistence to science, and your persistence to speak truth no matter the opposition and no matter the censorship. And thank you for the foundation, because that is going to yield the changes, hopefully, in policy, in government. We don't like to talk about that, but I think it's required to actually bring not just medicine back to its origin, doctors back to patients, but by God, bring government back to the citizenship. It really is a parallel. So thank you for what you and y'all at the foundation have done. And please, all of these links will be in the captions below and in the show notes. So check those out. We'll put it in social media. Nicholas, thank you for taking time out of your evening.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Well, thanks for joining us on this podcast. That's a Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear podcast, where we talked a little bit COVID, a little bit spike protein, censorship, and a little bit of turbo cancer. We need your help. Please like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. Download, and please get this information out there. There are millions of people that need to hear this, and please go and support the McCullough Foundation. And trust me, you want to follow Nicholas on X or LinkedIn. Go to his LinkedIn account and just blow it up. But let's support these great people in this great foundation that have really spoken truth when nobody else would. Thank you for joining Dr. Nathan Goodyear with the Prescribed Podcast. I will see you on the next podcast. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Prescribed Podcast. All references supporting this episode can be found on the prescribe.com website. That's pre-scribe.com. To get your next dose of medical innovation, make sure you subscribe to Prescribe. We'll see you for your next refill.